My phone has been blowing up with a million text messages, so thank you for that. This is a bit of a synthesised version of some of the questions that came through. So I got a lot of questions about red lines for Australia. Mr. Varghese was talking about Australia should deal with China based on values and interests. We got some questions about what specifically would those red lines be. We got some questions about an invasion of Taiwan as well as a bit of an example. So what should Australia do in the event of an invasion of Taiwan, and what do you think it's likely to do?
Well, I think the first thing Australia should do is to do anything we can to try and prevent a conflict between the United States and China, because the consequences of a conflict between the United States and China would be enormous, not just for the US and China, but for the region and for Australian interests. Personally, I don't think the likelihood of a war over China is all that high. I don't think China is looking to take on the United States in a military conflict. I think China's strategic policy for a very long time has been to win wars without fighting, and I suspect they have that ambition across the Taiwan Straits as well. I think under President Trump there would be a real question as to whether the United States would come to the defense of Taiwan were there to be a military action across the strait. Unlikely, though, I think that is to be. I mean, President Biden went a long way towards abolishing strategic ambiguity and making it clear that the United States would defend Taiwan. I think everything that President Trump has said suggests to me that he sees things quite differently. So, there's a lot of press given to the fact that Xi Jinping has asked for the PLA to be ready by 2027 to take Taiwan if necessary. I don't think we should read that as the Chinese moving towards an invasion of Taiwan by 2027. So there is a real national interest here for us in doing what we can to avoid conflict between the US and China.
I have friends who go through all of the public speeches of Xi where he mentions war readiness, and it is something like 100 times on public occasions. There are things like tunnels being built in Fujian province, which is very close to Taiwan, strategic resources stockpiling, blood donation stations being built, civilian militia being trained. So that is one thing. Another is the word on the street is that the generals or military commanders who are not as gung-ho about military intervention have lost their jobs. But then I also hear that on the Taiwan side, there is now, everything's very fluid. It's all changing by the month, that there is less fear about an actual China mainland takeover, from some polls. And it is hard to say whether of course, 2027 is the 100-year anniversary of the PLA, whether the invasion will happen, or is it just a date that's been mentioned for war readiness.
Yeah, and it's also true that as a proportion of its economy, China spends less on its military than Australia does. It spends about half that as the US. So I think it's important that we keep that context in mind. You often hear this statement, China spends more on its military than the rest of Asia combined. Yes, its economy is bigger than the rest of Asia combined. So China is capable of assembling enormous military might that we can't ignore. I'm certainly not suggesting we should, but let's just keep it in context.
Thank you.
China spends more defending against its own people than on the military.
Indeed.
Could we have another question from the floor, please?
Oh, hello?
Yep.
So this is I think Cheng may have brought this up earlier, and I just want to ask a bit more detail. So after the 2022 federal election, the Liberal Party carried out an internal review, and it deemed that the Morrison government's rhetoric was a key reason why the party lost the Chinese vote across the capital cities. So I guess my question is, how much credence do you give that review? Because now the Liberal Party is effectively acting on that policy, so they don't dare to criticize China because it may offend local Chinese voters. How much credibility do you give that review? And in your research, do you feel like that review may have, have gaps in how they actually got the attitudes of local Chinese voters? Thanks.
I don't know what data they use, but I know of, say, the Menzies electorate in Melbourne, which has the highest concentration of Chinese Australians. In the Liberal Party room after the election loss, the Chinese volunteers were crying because they felt that the party had let them down. And of the 1.4 million overseas Chinese or Chinese Australians with Chinese heritage, I haven't read data that shows their voting eligibility and their voting attitudes. But I guess anecdotally, there is this sense, and I see this perpetuated on Chinese language social media platforms about Australian politics. For example, the Liberal Senator Jane Hume had made the unfortunate comment of Chinese spies about a United Front affiliated volunteer with the Labor Party, and was it Labor or Liberal? Anyway, but that comment stuck so much that she became known as Chinese spy woman. So the negative rhetoric can really, really damage sentiment, and especially given the psychological difference in the Chinese Australians perceive any slight to China as, they take it personally, which others probably wouldn't.
James, did you want to add?
No, I disagree. Anecdotally, the Chinese Australian electorate shifted towards Labor over the 2022 and the 2025 election. I think it's fascinating what's going on in the coalition at the moment with that electorate. Let me just make a broader point. These are Australians, okay? We call them Chinese Australians, but they're Australians. And Australians in a democracy are allowed to hold any views that they want as long as it's not contrary to Australian law. So just because...
Unless they are influenced covertly.
Exactly. And that's why, thank God, we have foreign interference laws, right? So you'll not see a single negative comment from me about Australia introducing foreign interference laws or enforcing those laws. We certainly need to protect our diaspora from that, from that interference. I don't disagree.
But in reality, it's much more subtle. For example, WeChat groups where the Chinese host of the group will say, anyone who has, views about Taiwan reunification or Taiwan independence should get out, shouldn't speak in this group. That sort of fear.
Peter.
Can I just say, I think the Morrison government got hoisted on its own petard at the end of the day because, James referred to Australian diplomacy in that period as being, the worst that he's seen. This was not clumsy diplomacy by accident. This was a judgment that it played well domestically in Australia to be seen to take a very tough line on China. And so the tougher the line, the better the domestic play. What happened as a consequence of all of that is that it did have an impact in 5 or 6 seats with a reasonably high proportion of Chinese Australians who voted against the coalition and for the Labor Party in 2022. And that, remember, was a very close election. And so I think there's some truth to the review as quoted by the questioner about the outcome and its link back to a position on China.
Yes.
We have a question from Pavlo Voitenko. For firms doing transaction diligence in Queensland, so mergers and acquisitions, private equity, infrastructure, what are the red flags or early indicators in the China-Australia relationship that should trigger a recalibration of valuation or risk premium? How far out should we be looking, e.g. supply chain fragility, export bans, investment screening changes?
I think that's one for you, James.
Yeah, sure. Look, last week, I was in Shanghai for the China International Import Expo, a major trade fair. And I was talking to a major Australian company there about how they were viewing geopolitical risk. And he said two things to me, this C-suite executive. He said, first of all, geopolitical risk is just one of the many risks that we have to deal with daily. Businesses deal with risks, and that's a routine operation for them. He said the biggest risk they actually have in China is not really geopolitical risk like we saw in 20, it's more regulatory risk. The fact that the regulations could change overnight and suddenly their business strategy they were implementing previously doesn't work so well. But then he said the second thing to me, he said, but you know what? Regulatory risk is a whole lot worse in Vietnam, Malaysia and India. So that's the challenge for Australian business. It's not finding perfection. No one's going to find that. But actually, I think most businesses, when they engage with China, it's not perfect, but they look around the region and they don't see a lot of other better options.
No, indeed. Do we have anything further? Yes.
James, could I ask you, you mentioned the whip-smart young Chinese lady, and I thought you were going to tell us a bit more about her. But what was her perception of Australia, and what do you think the Chinese people, if there is such an entity as the Chinese people, think about Australia? Is it just a good place to come and hold koalas, or what do they think?
Well, the short story was I was the first Australian she'd ever met. I mean, she'd literally never left China, and in fact, there's many parts of China she hadn't been to either, so I was it. And I can tell you afterwards, she was posting on her WeChat moments all these pictures of Australian, lamb and meat and and koalas and so on. So I think Chinese people are pretty positive at a fundamental sense towards Australia. But look, actually, let me say this. The truth is most Chinese don't wake up in the morning and think about Australia, right? And the Chinese government certainly don't. They wake up in the morning and think about China, China, China. And then fourth in the list is they probably think about America, not Australia.
I am a follower of the Chinese version of Quora, Zhihu, and it's very, very good for gleaning attitudes of the middle class about Australia, about immigration, because it's such a hot topic. And of those answers, the people who have already emigrated would say that if you are powerful and moneyed, come to Australia, you'll be fine. If you have no money, if you are struggling and you're able to come to Australia, you'd love it. But for those who kind of get along fairly well in the Chinese system and enjoy the nightlife and cheap courier services and other personal services and so on, they might find it hard to stay here. But those who love it here would always mention the kindness of the people, the fact that animals aren't afraid of people, the freedom and the much more relaxed pace of life due to the 996 from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week kind of working lifestyle in China. But there are some really interesting answers there.
Thanks. Yes.
Hello, could I ask the panelists, what's your opinion on the medium to long-term consequences of the demographic situation, with China's fertility rate now being about 1.0, which of course is less than half the replacement rate?
Yeah, look, it's a headwind, but I don't panic about it because, first of all, demographic trends are a headwind, but they don't change overnight, right? So in other words, that does at least give the Chinese government opportunity to respond in the policy realm. And you're seeing some of that. For example, historically, China's had a low female participation rate in the workforce. Okay, so you can work on that one. The retirement age can be raised.
The participation rate is very high. I know.
I'm pretty sure if you check China
high.
compared with other countries,
it's just the glass ceiling is very low.
I'm just looking at the data, okay? So automation's another option that China has available to it. And the other thing I'll say, and sounds awful, so I'm an economist speaking here, okay? you can talk about the quantity and the quality of the labour force. Economists talk about this. They don't mean this in a moral way. But if you look at the people that are exiting the Chinese labour force, they're typically people who had a primary school education, no more. The people entering the Chinese labour force are, often, have PhDs, master's degrees, and so on. So in terms of the productivity of the labour force, in aggregate, it's not something I panic about. There's other things I worry about more.
I think it's probably more than headwinds. I mean, if you do believe that demography is destiny, then the age profile in China would have to be a pretty serious concern to you. But bear in mind that this is now a global trend, because in virtually every country in the world, we are seeing a drop in fertility. Even in those parts of the world like Africa and South Asia, which we traditionally sort of picture as having very high fertility rates and large families, the graphs are consistently coming down in terms of fertility. So this is going to become actually quite a serious long-term global problem. And I'm not sure there are a lot of answers that are readily available.
I think it might be beyond us this evening. But thank you for the question. It's a very live one, and questions appreciated.
There's more questions.
We have another synthesised question. So a lot of the questions that have been sent in concern the growing influence of China among Pacific Island nations. And also one thing that was pointed out was that China has undertaken a very significant military build-up, one of the largest since, I think, the largest since World War II, and that doesn't belie peaceful intent. So can we get some comment from the panel on China's growing influence in the Pacific? What's the state of competition between Australia and China, China and the United States in the Pacific? And should we be concerned considering that China has had this large military build-up?
Peter, do you want to start on the Pacific and move to the other two panelists?
I mean, the foreign minister has described this as a permanent competition between Australia and China, and I think there's a fair degree of truth to that. I mean, China is pursuing influence across the world, so it's not as if that the Pacific is sort of uniquely high on its list of priorities. But for Australia, if a Chinese presence in the Pacific were to extend to the establishment of a military base, that would cause us a very high degree of strategic angst for pretty good reasons. And so I think we are going to have a long-term competition between Australia and China over influence in small Pacific Island countries. Now, I think Australia brings huge assets to that competition in the short and the medium term, because that goes to the density of our connections to the Pacific countries, the networks that we have, the increasing labour market flows between them and Australia, a certain cultural connection, including through football and so on. So in the short to medium term, I'm pretty optimistic that Australia can handle this. In the long term, I suspect it's going to depend on whose pockets are deeper. And there, I think we won't do well.
And we've also lost some of the company that we had in the Pacific since the United States and many European donors have withdrawn.
Could we give the mic to someone who is very qualified to answer this question? Nick Coyle, who fought relentlessly for my freedom, and he's got the lived-in experience of running the chamber in China for a number of years, and also running a business in Papua New Guinea for the past 6 years.
Sorry, what was the question again? No, I'm joking. Sorry, James, I was just fact-checking you on the female participation rate.
Is it true?
No, you're wrong. Sorry.
You can say that about Japan, though.
Yeah. In fact, China's participation rate's been going down, so there you go. So, yeah, getting back to the Pacific, what was the nub of the question was around...
influence.
Influence. Look, having somebody who grew up in the Pacific and is back there doing business and lived in China for a long time, I'd say we're getting absolutely slaughtered as a regional influencer in the region. Australia is in particular. Our business communities have disengaged in a significant way. China's pushing into the region more and more, especially through other countries, I would say Malaysia in particular. So a lot of Malaysian Chinese business is being used as a proxy for Chinese business into the region, which I'm seeing that more and more now. So it's not only direct Chinese business, but a lot of Chinese support coming through businesses that they influence. So I think that's a huge impact. In my little part of the world, PNG, it's kind of where in my view, the strategic game begins and ends, because it's the most important country in the South Pacific by a country mile. And how that plays out over the next 5 to 10 years, I think is going to be really interesting. But Australia's dropped the ball over the past, I'm sorry, Peter, not your fault, over the past 25 or 30 years in that region, and we're really paying for it. It's as simple as that. And yeah.
We've had some pretty fast pedaling in the last couple of years, perhaps, but I accept the point you're making. Thanks, Nick.
No problems.
Joe, did you notice the question was that China's increase in military spending belies a peaceful intent? There's a fascinating thing I like to see every year in the Australian media when the Chinese budget gets released. You'll see this headline, China's military spending increases by 10%. Well, that sounds a lot. You notice you never see a headline, China's diplomacy increases by 15%. China's education spending increases by 18%. China's military spending is increasing a lot every year because its economy is growing a lot every year. Its government is spending more on everything. And as I said before, as a proportion of its economy, its military spending is actually less than that of Australia and way behind that of the US.
Are some of the concerns, perhaps, James, related to capability, though? That's the kind of capability that China is developing and the obvious display of that capability?
Well, I'd prefer that they're displaying missiles on the streets of Beijing rather than hurling them at countries like some other countries out there, in fact, routinely do. So is capability
The
something we have
streets
to
that
take...
once killed its own people.
Yeah, no, come on, that's a completely... You're doing a switch of topic there, right? I'm just saying the capability is something we have to take seriously. I don't disagree with that. But put it in context. That's all I'm asking.
Peter, you've got
Well, we should be clear that China's ambition is to be the predominant power in the region. And to become the predominant power, you have to have a very substantial military capability. So you cannot divorce the investment in military capability from the broader strategic objective.